She says, and I quote, "It is strange and stimulating to suddenly discover, at the age of 40, an aspect of the world that was blindingly obvious, but that I had never seen." She realizes, and we along with her, that this world was a masculine world. My childhood was nourished by myths created by men. I would not have reacted at all in the same way if I had been a boy. So Simone de Beauvoir sets out to deconstruct the myths and inventions, one by one, that force a woman to live as a secondary being, relative to another being. These myths are and have been created all through history and in every discipline and in all areas of existence. To be feminine, in quotation marks, really is a code for being secondary, being dominated. Shortly after the French book came out, reinforced by the first English translation, the roots of the feminist movement that came to fruition in the 1970s began to take hold and thrive. In re-examining the second sex, we saw our personal histories. In 1964, Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique, closely modeled after significant chapters of the second sex. The Feminine Mystique being the English counterpart of Beauvoir's Éternel Féminin. Carol Gilligan, here in the audience, in her trailblazing work, In a Different Voice, Psychological Theory and Women's Development, analyzes masculine biases, and like Beauvoir, inveighs against those biases that Beauvoir's work so thoroughly deconstructs. Beauvoir's view of women opened the door 40 years ago to second-wave feminism, which has shown that throughout history, culture has been marked by a systematic oppression of women. Hundreds, if not thousands, of books, studies, and other works followed and are still coming out. In fact, Beauvoir crafted a whole new way of talking about women. She weighed her words. A quote, "When I use the words woman or feminine," she says in The Second Sex, "I obviously refer to no archetype, to no immutable essence. In the present state of education and customs must be understood to follow most of my affirmations. There is no question of expressing eternal truths here, but rather of describing the common ground from which all singular feminine existence stems." Simone de Beauvoir identified existentialism as a philosophy suited to the spirit of the times because it defended human dignity and the importance of morals and commitment. Catapulted by the immense success and clout of The Second Sex into feminist affairs, Beauvoir lived long enough to become a militant and an icon in the French feminist movement, working in tandem with French feminist pioneers like Gisèle Halimi and Yvette Roudy. And she, in turn, was influenced and motivated by her cooperatives in the American and other feminist movements. We saw in this period the concrete example of turning philosophy and ideology into political action, policymaking, and even legislation. Today, there is a Simone de Beauvoir Award, inaugurating at her centennial in January 2008, and given yearly to women fighting for freedom of expression, and against oppression of women in all forms and all places. Internationally known philosopher Julia Kristeva heads the Simone de Beauvoir Prize Committee. But in a message that resonates, alas, today here in the US and elsewhere, she warns against the traps women fall into, the ruses of society that deprive women of their right to freedom and human dignity, what we recognize today as backlash. The methodology of The Second Sex is complex and yet simple. It is an empirical study of woman in two parts, facts and myths and then lived experience. In the French, there were 2 volumes. In the English, there's only 1. The overriding theme is myths, biological myths, psychoanalytical myths, historical ones, religious, economic, literary, and so on. We see how these myths play themselves out in the lives of women in the situations in which they are found. One of the most far-reaching myths, and the most tenacious, is that of biological superiority, woman as the weaker sex. Beauvoir scoured the latest findings on reproductive biology, and while they and the language may be dated today, she boldly analyzed them through her prism, and I quote, "There are 2 movements that come together in life, and life maintains itself only by surpassing itself. It does not surpass itself without maintaining itself. Whereas the sperm moves around, the ovum is incapable of triggering the change that will bring about a new explosion of life. Without the egg's prescience, the sperm's action would be useless. But without the latter's initiative, the egg would not accomplish its vital potential." The conclusion is thus that fundamentally, the role of the 2 gametes is identical. Together, they create a living being in which both of them lose and surpass themselves. But in the secondary and superficial phenomena that condition fertilization, it is through the male element that the change in situation occurs for the new eclosion of life. It is through the female element that this eclosion is established in a stable element. And then in the next sentence, Simone de Beauvoir adds, "It would be rash to deduce from such an observation that woman's place is in the home. But there are rash people." With an amazing amount of courage, Beauvoir also sets out to dispel sacred myths created by the great thinkers and groundbreakers in psychoanalysis and historical materialism, Freud and Engels, among others. Freud's famous axiom, anatomy is destiny, is torn to pieces, and it is here that existentialism carries the argument. She refutes the deterministic approach to personality and to sexuality, and dares to defy Freud's masculinist interpretation of feminine libido, penis envy, and the Oedipus complex. Beauvoir uses Wilhelm Stekel, a pioneer in studies of frigidity in woman, as her psychoanalytical reference point for defining sexual behavior of women, and not Freud. She denounces Engels' determinism that is based on the consequences of technology and economic factors, of inheritance, of domestic and family needs relative to society, of defined and assigned roles in society. Today, her message still holds true. Sexual monism or economic monism all serve to hold women hostage to ideas that keep women subjugated to men. Beauvoir says, and I quote, "This world has always belonged to men," and then spends 5 chapters defining how and why this happened throughout history in an attempt to determine how privileges and permissions have been granted to men and not to women, how woman's biological functions, her fertility and fecundity, have served to create an imbalance of who produces and who reproduces in society. Man establishes himself as master because he risks his life and kills, while woman, quote, settles for giving life. Quote, "The triumph of patriarchy was neither an accident nor the result of a violent revolution. From the origins of humanity, their biological privilege enabled men to affirm themselves alone as sovereign subjects. They never abdicated this privilege. They alienated part of their existence in nature and in woman, but they won it back afterwards. Condemned to play the role of the other, woman was thus condemned to possess no more than precarious power. Slave or idol, It was never she who chose her lot. These notions of patriarchy grow out of history, as, for example, the superiority of paternal rights over maternal ones in the family. Such paradigms, once established, continue to perpetuate themselves simply by nature of the fact that they had been established in the past. Through the Middle Ages, these myths continued to obtain, and no amount of feminine heroism seems to register enough importance to dispel them. Women have little place in the official history of the world. Beauvoir tried to change all that in a radical move by strikingly recounting her story, bringing to life and to light the roles women have played in making and thinking the world.
At the end of the first volume, in the French, in the part called Myths, perhaps one of the most revealing, avant-garde, and innovative chapters of the second sex, Beauvoir launches a feminist textual literary analysis. Thanks. She chooses 5 important literary figures to deconstruct, and could certainly have found more, showing how literature and male writers have been willing accomplices, if not activists, casting women in a secondary role to men, always putting her in the position of the other, depriving her of her subjecthood. Starting with Henri de Montalent, the worst of the lot for her, she moves to D.H. Lawrence, who she considers pretty bad too, moving to the middle ground where she analyzes Paul Claudel, and then she moves to André Breton and to Stendhal. Breton remains relatively unscathed, and Stendhal comes out the hero in understanding women and granting them subjecthood, their rightful place. Even Stendhal, though, expected altruism from women. Later on, she valorizes women writers, from Louisa May Alcott to Colette, Catherine Mansfield, Dorothy Parker, Virginia Woolf, and many more. She quotes extensively from many women writers of her time, unfortunately largely unknown today, but certainly worthy of inclusion. Since Beauvoir's analysis, feminist movements have grown. Histories have been rewritten to include the roles of important women figures, and a wealth of women writers have come to the fore to receive the attention and glory due to them. Half of the world, hereto hidden and unknown, has appeared and continues regularly to come out of the darkness, thanks to ever-increasing feminist work and gender studies. All of this began with the second sex. This is not the first translation of the Le Deuxième Sexe into English, but it is the first complete one. H.M. Parsley translated it in 1953, but upon the insistence of his publisher, Alfred Knopf, he abridged and edited passages, restructured Simone de Beauvoir's syntax and style, and simplified much of the complex philosophical language. In our work, we rarely looked at the Parsley translation, so we can't compare ours to his. But the few times that we did look, for example, if we encountered an obscure passage or an ambiguous passage in the French, we found that he very often glossed over or cut it out completely. Sometimes we wish we could have done the same, but of course we didn't. This particular translation is no ordinary one, and there are several reasons why. First of all, a new translation of the second sex has been ardently desired and awaited for many years. It is used today, as you all know, in gender studies and philosophy courses all over the English-speaking world. But academics have long been very dissatisfied with it. To steal Simone de Beauvoir's phrase, much ink has flowed on the subject of the English version.